noticed now how Catherine's leg dug with a jackhammer under the table, and how her eyes snapped a tape measure across the board. Despite the amazing comeback, the mood in the room had tangibly shifted. Gone was the laughter and the joking. All eyes were on the game as Catherine's little red lamb bounced back and forth, and as Agnes's piece charged towards the finish. The silence was broken only by the clanging of dice. No one moved, no one breathed. And then, finally, it was over. Agnes sat back, a smile spreading across her face. She made it. A sense of pride cheered with her relief. A glance at the kitchen clock told her they'd been playing for the better part of 3 hours. She was more than ready to go home. But the blanket of silence that now smothered the room kept her seated. Catherine stared at the pieces before her, as if she couldn't comprehend what had just happened. The rest of the group was just as dumbfounded. But Agnes didn't care. She was only focused on getting home. And so she barely even noticed when Uma bent down and grabbed something. Catherine noticed, though. She whipped her head up to face her, words Agnes couldn't guess forming on her lips. She never got the chance to say them. In one fluid motion, Uma pulled a knife, a real knife, out of the game box, leaned over the table, and slashed it across Catherine's throat. Blood sprayed across the board and everything else. Suddenly, the symbols Agnes hadn't understood began to glow a deep orange color. A strange hum filled the air. Not loud, but insistent, vibrating the board as Catherine's blood continued to spill. Her eyes darted around the room as she clutched her neck, blood pumping from between her fingers. She locked eyes with Agnes, her expression a mix of rage and helplessness. But Agnes couldn't do anything. She sat, frozen, as Catherine slumped over, head smacking onto the game board. Out of nowhere, Trent produced a bowl, and with an unceremonious flick of his hand, he wiped some of the blood from where it had pooled and fed it into the...
On the question of how much time there is for these plaintiffs to act and for these countries to act, the IPCC has said that we have to basically halve our carbon emissions globally by the end of this decade, like 6 years away, Pat.
Right. And the lawyers for the youth plaintiffs made a big point about how rapidly the nations in Europe and elsewhere have to move in order to meet their commitments under the Paris Agreement. We're way behind. They actually presented evidence from an entity known as the Carbon Action Tracker, or CAT. And it's very quantitative evidence of what each individual nation's fair share would be in terms of reducing emissions. So they've laid out a blueprint. Again, if the court decides to take this case on, and if it decides to genuinely engage with the question of what exactly is your legal obligation, each and every one of you, this will be a dramatic breakthrough for climate change. It's pushing the boundaries of how far courts should go when you have a problem of this nature. But it certainly is an opportunity for the court to put down a very strong marker here, and we'll see if it does it.
Right, because the Paris Climate Agreement, if I understand it correctly, is not actually legally binding. And so it sounds like a decision from this court may actually put some teeth behind that.
You're exactly right, Jenny. The Paris Agreement sets goals, but it doesn't impose binding targets. It does have binding procedural obligations like disclosing what your emissions are. But when it comes to limiting global warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius, no, that's not a legally binding obligation. That's their ultimate goal in this case, is to make that 1.5 degree limit legally enforceable throughout the European Union countries to start with, and then hopefully beyond that. This court does have the power to issue a legally binding order if they're willing to do it.
Pat, we've seen a lot of youth climate cases hit the headlines here in the U.S. To what extent are we seeing a global pattern here?
The number of human rights-based cases and the number of cases being brought by youth plaintiffs is steadily increasing, both in the United States and elsewhere. So it's a sign, of course, that the governments who are ultimately responsible, that political process is not responding to the crisis in the way that's necessary. And more people are turning to the courts, and they're seeking ever, in my view, sophisticated and innovative remedies and arguments and theories. I mean, they're pushing the law. Climate change is pushing the law. Climate change is going to push this court, I think, in the direction of issuing something, hopefully, positive in this case.
Patrick Parento is an emeritus professor at Vermont Law School. Thank you so much, Pat.
Thanks, Jenny. Always a pleasure.
It's just about that time for a look beyond the headlines with our Living on Earth contributor, Peter Dykstra. He's joining us now from Atlanta, Georgia. Hey there, Peter. How are you?
I'm doing well, Paloma, and I hope you're doing well, too. Here's a story about a species that may not be doing well, a prized species for sport fishermen in the uppermost part of the U.S. side of the Great Lakes. As the Great Lakes warm, some of the feeder streams along the Minnesota coastline may be getting too warm for brook trout to survive.
And from what I understand, the Great Lakes have over 150 native fishes, and it's huge for sport fishing. What are natural resource managers going to do about this?
Well, natural resources managers alone can't do a whole lot about water getting warmer. But by mid-century, the researchers say about a third of the streams in the area studied, the way far north Lake Superior shoreline of Minnesota, will be too warm to host a brook trout.
Just another unfortunate impact of the climate crisis, huh? What else do you have for us, Peter?
Something else that's also not good news is something from another cold region. Polar bears might be further affected by climate change. We already know that declining ice is a problem, but that declining ice drives mother polar bears onto land, and when those polar bears nurse where no polar bear food is available on land, there's a problem with raising young polar bears. It's a study published in the Marine Ecology Progress series saying that lactation is, quote, negatively affected by increased time spent on land when the sea ice melts, which we all know is happening very quickly in the Arctic.
Well, I've seen images of struggling mother polar bears, and they're just heartbreaking.
It is, and it was thought that that was simply due to a lack of food. This is some scientific evidence that that lack of
All relate that either the sewage was blue or it was gray. And the gray wastewater and black wastewater comes from toilet facilities at the base. So it could be like sinks and showers, and it's that gray water, and it has a residue in it which contains phosphates and other chemicals as well. But the blue that they were seeing was a dye that comes from portable toilets, which, you know, like also has an array of chemicals that can have different levels of toxicities that are harmful to human health as well. So I started looking at studies that were done on wastewater and sewage sludge in other countries where, for example, sewage would go through a treatment process. And even that sewage had chemicals in it that couldn't be removed, such as PFAs, which are also known as forever chemicals, just because they have a really long shelf life. And those chemicals have been linked to a whole array of health problems, kidney problems, cancer. So I started to realize that this sewage and wastewater that was being dumped in the fields was, incredibly harmful to the farmers who were working there, and children that were working there as well, just because they talked about how it had been dumped for 20 years.
Yeah, and those PFAS forever chemicals, municipalities here in the U.S. are spending many millions of dollars per facility to install systems that remove those chemicals. And we know that military bases, often use these chemicals in their operations. So I can only imagine how much more difficult it would be in Afghanistan.
Yeah, I spoke with, as well as the residents living around the bases, I spoke with contractors who were tasked with the job of pulling this waste off the bases and finding somewhere to dump it. And they just relayed a really big problem just because of the amount of waste the bases were producing. Some of them had 40,000 troops on them at one point, and there was just so much waste it couldn't all be burnt in a burn pit. It had to go somewhere. And one of the other areas aside from fields for sewage was waterways. And for the contractors, one of the reasons one relayed was that they could save on fuel if they found somewhere close by to dump. And in terms of those in charge at the bases, the waste really wasn't their priority at the time, and they were fighting a war, and the responsibility really went with the contractors to come up with their own solution of where to put the waste. No one was really checking it or thinking about any long-term impacts, I think, at the time. And there was no laws or any prohibitions really from a U.S. military perspective or international perspective that was stopping them from dumping in waterways and fields and land, or burning in areas around also.
A couple of years ago, when the U.S. finally did pull out of Afghanistan, there was a lot of talk about how important it was, this moral obligation that we had to help out some of the Afghans who had helped us during the war and who had, worked with the U.S. military, interpreted for the U.S. military, done a whole range of different things. So some of those people were able to come to the U.S. and flee the Taliban. But it seems like there's kind of a lack of understanding of the obligation that we have to protect Afghans from the environmental degradation that we've caused there.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think there's any responsibility from the American military to protect Afghans. And I think that one of the reasons that we don't know much about U.S. military waste, or it's not shared, is that they're not required to share what they do with their waste. Like if it comes to the Paris Agreement, they're not required to share what fuel they use and how much they're really emitting greenhouse gases, for example. There's this whole black box on responsibility just because they don't actually have to share that information. And I think on top of that, there's actually a DoD prohibition that means that the U.S. military doesn't actually have to clean up its bases when it leaves from a country overseas, and that it's then the host nation's responsibility to clean up. And you look at the amount of bases in Afghanistan and the size of them, they are still sitting exactly the same today as August 2021 when America left. You can see it on satellite today. You can still see the amount of scrap and broken tanks and engines, and then on top of that you can still see the burn pits, some as big as 3 football fields, still scorched and charred from how they were left. So there was a lack of care when they were there at the bases for both their own service members and for the entire Afghan population, but then a definite lack after they left, because they don't need to. There's no requirement for them to care about the environmental damage that they had on the country.
Yeah. What kinds of health impacts did you see on the ground while in Afghanistan? Can you tell us a story or two from Afghan civilians that really stood out to you?
Yeah, there was a lot of stories. I spoke to a lot of people. One thing though that does come up is that there's definitely a pattern with the same health problems, which very much mirror the health problems of U.S. service members who were returning from deployment. One around Jalalabad airfield, there was a farmer, his name's Mohammed. He had been working there for 20 years and field just by the base, and his whole family helped him work in this field. And he had two sons who were 5 and 7, who both have kidney problems. He had another son who had other health problems. Their cousins had kidney problems. His mother had skin rash, a persistent skin rash, and she was working the land as well in that field. And so you have this whole family working in this field where tankers are dumping sewage waste, and they're coming down with really serious kidney problems, even at the ages of 5 and 7.
Wow.
And they really believe that they're sick from the waste being dumped in their field. But the reality is that they can't afford medical treatment they need, or they can't afford to constantly go and see doctors. And there's really not much they can do. You know, and then you go to speak to the farmer next to Mohammed. There was another one next to him called Walila, and he had the exact same problem, he had the same kidney problems. And so doctors might say, oh, it's from the water. But then the doctors also in that area know what's happening in the area, and they know the waste is being dumped there. And there's a pattern here. People are getting sick from the same things. They're drinking and washing in the same rivers. They're working on the same land. They're eating the food they grow in the fields. It's all connected.
And like you say, they don't really have the resources to get the medical help they need. I mean, I think in your story there was somebody who maybe would need a kidney transplant at some point, but that's several thousands of dollars.
Yeah, and also, you know, there's people in areas that didn't have the possibility to travel to get the medical treatment they needed before because there was ongoing fighting going on as well. I mean, a lot of people travel to Pakistan to get treatment just because Afghanistan doesn't have the resources for medicines available for them as well.
I think in their story you came upon a couple of kids who were collecting scrap metal from one of the piles of just waste that was left behind. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, they were had a little shop across the road from Kandahar airfield, and they moved there after their father had died, and they were making a living off scrap metal collecting. And there's outside of Jalalabad and Kandahar and Bagram are just rows and rows of little shops with a whole array of scrap in them, all of which comes from the base. And these two boys, you know, they had everything from broken motors and seats to Humvees to grenades, like full grenades still.
And live grenades?
Live grenades were still like with the keyhole, and, you know, unexploded artillery shells. So there's all these dangers of just them collecting these things just on top of and the kind of backdrop of all these other things going on, you know, during the war. And a lot of the scrap metal collectors, not just in Kandahar, had these kind of persistent skin rashes and problems as well. And the doctors were telling me about this also. And this is just because of the materials that they're dealing with on a daily basis.
This is really heavy reporting, Lindsay. What keeps you going back to Afghanistan to report stories like this?
I think I'll keep going back to Afghanistan until I can't get in anymore. And it is getting harder to get in. I think that Afghanistan is a country which the effects of this kind of environmental damage and the effects of the war in general, they didn't go away when the US left in 2021, and they're still there, and people are still there waiting for answers and some level of accountability. And this is an American war in Afghanistan, and I think especially Americans should really know about what happened there and what happened with these waste disposal practices. And also just because the US military is in so many countries around the world using the exact same waste disposal practices, and right now there is no law saying they have to clean up. There is nothing that's stopping that.
Lindsay Belling is a freelance journalist who wrote about this for Inside Climate News, and New Lines magazine. Thank you so much, Lindsay.
Thank you so much for having me.
Living on Earth is produced by the World Media Foundation. Our crew includes Naomi Ehrenberg, Josh Kroom, Swayam Gagnija, Maddie Hibbs, Mozzie Ingram, Mark Kausch, Mark Seth-Lender, Don Lyman, Sarah Mahaney, Ainsley O'Neill, Sophia Pandelides, Jake Rico, Elle Wilson, and Yolanda Omori.
Tom Tiger engineered our show. Allison Lurstein composed our themes. You can hear us anytime at LOE.org, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts. And like us, please, on our Facebook page, Living on Earth. We tweet from @LivingOnEarth and find us on Instagram @LivingOnEarthRadio. And you can write to us at comments@LOE.org. Steve Kerwood is our executive producer. I'm Paloma Beltran.
And I'm Jenny Doring. Thanks for listening.
Funding for Living on Earth comes from you, our listeners, and from the University of Massachusetts, Boston, in association with its School for the Environment, developing the next generation of environmental leaders, and from the Grantham Foundation for the Protection of the Environment, supporting strategic communications and collaboration in solving the world's most pressing environmental problems.
PRX.
Support comes from I1 Unique Eyewear, a local independent optical shop with classic styles in tortoise to distinctive shapes in a kaleidoscope of colors, celebrating over 20 years on Hyde Park Square. Also in Dayton at the shops of Oakwood. I-1.com. I1 Unique Eyewear. Discover great art.
Just before noon, it's 54 degrees in Cincinnati on our way to a gloomy high of 56. I'm Oakley Scott. Thanks so much for sharing your Sunday with us. More great listening for you this afternoon. Hope you can stick around or at least take us along. Milk Street Radio coming up at 1, The Splendid Table at 2, Rick Steves at 3. Right now, the New Yorker Radio Hour with guest Linda Ronstadt is coming up next.
91.7 WVXU Cincinnati and 88.5 WMUB Oxford. News from Cincinnati Public Radio and NPR.
You probably know Werner Herzog as a director, and a very prolific one, with more than 70 films under his belt. But as he tells it, movies like Fitzcarraldo and Grizzly Man are just a prequel to the real work.
My films are a distraction right now. You have to see something else in me as well. I'm a writer, and my writing will probably outlive my films.
Today on the New Yorker Radio Hour, Werner Herzog, plus the author of an account more frightening than any fiction.
He ran on a platform of death, and that's not an exaggeration. He promised that the fish would feed fat on the corpses of criminals. He said morticians would grow rich with a deluge of dead.
The violent regime of Rodrigo Duterte. That's all in the New Yorker Radio Hour right after the news.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Nora Robb. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is in Egypt, where he met today with President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi. A statement said the U.S. wants to prevent the conflict between Israel and Hamas from spreading. It also said the two men agreed on the importance of addressing the humanitarian situation in Gaza. White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan says the U.S. is also concerned about the people now held hostage by Hamas.
Well, for President Biden, they are a priority. They're the highest possible priority, and he has sent hostage experts to coordinate and consult with the Israeli government on hostage recovery efforts. He's also made sure that our diplomats are in touch with third countries in the region to explore avenues for their safe release. I have to be cautious about how much I can say about certain efforts he's undertaking because we want to protect those efforts.
Sullivan was interviewed on CNN. U.S. college students have been speaking out and protesting for Palestinian rights following Hamas attack on Israel. Even before the recent escalation, NPR's Alyssa Nadworny reports the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been one of the most contentious issues on campus.
The National Organization of Students for Justice in Palestine told NPR that they expect universities to defend and protect students' right to speak and protest. Radhika Sinath, a senior staff attorney at Palestine Legal, an advocacy group that provides legal help with free speech and academic freedom issues, says they've seen a major spike in calls this week.
So many people have been saying, can I say that I support Palestinian rights? Can I say that
I stand against Israeli military occupation or for Palestinian freedom. Am I allowed to do this at my university?
Students say they are facing harassment, death threats, or doxing, where their names and addresses are published online. Sanath tells them speech is protected on most campuses, even if it's controversial. Alyssa Nadworny, NPR News.
In Washington, after nearly 2 weeks of deadlock, House Republicans remain without a speaker. Ohio Congressman Jim Jordan has the nomination, but it's unclear if he can win the gavel. NPR's Susan Davis has more.
In a secret ballot election, 55 Republicans said they were still not ready to support Jordan on the House floor. A Republican speaker nominee can only lose 4 votes and still be elected speaker. Democrats will vote for their leader, Hakeem Jeffries of New York. Jordan sent lawmakers home for the weekend and said they would regroup on Monday. A floor vote is possible on Tuesday, but even Jordan's closest allies say he's unlikely to win it on the first ballot. Many Republicans were hoping to do so as a show of unity following the removal of former Speaker Kevin McCarthy. But any Republican nominee will likely need multiple ballots to win enough support to become Speaker. Susan Davis, NPR News, Washington.
This is NPR News. Poland is holding a parliamentary election today. The Nationalist Law and Justice Party is attempting to gain a 3rd term in office. Its main rival is the Liberal Civic Coalition Party, that claims the ruling partner has eroded the foundations of democracy in Poland by stripping the independence of the courts and the media. In Guatemala, a recent court decision has annulled the sentence of an imprisoned journalist, one of the most respected in Latin America. Maria Martin reports.
Muckraking journalist Jose Ruben Zamora has been in jail since July of 2022, sentenced to 6 years last June on a charge of money laundering, an accusation he says is politically motivated. The award-winning journalist was arrested soon after the publication of an investigation involving President Alejandro Yamatei. Now an appellate court says Zamora has to stand a new trial. The ruling comes as nationwide protests are ongoing in Guatemala, asking for the resignation of the Attorney General and other Justice Department officials responsible for Zamora's prosecution. For NPR News, I'm Maria Martin.
The president of Azerbaijan raised his nation's flag today in the capital of the former breakaway region of Nagorno-Karabakh. The territory had been controlled by ethnic Armenians since 1994, although internationally recognized as part of Azerbaijan. It was reclaimed by Azerbaijan forces last month. This forced the separatists out and prompted many of the 120,000 residents to flee to Armenia. I'm Nora Rahm, NPR News in Washington.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, recognizing exceptionally creative individuals. This year's MacArthur Fellows and more information are at macfound.org. This is NPR.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is currently 12:06, 55 degrees and cloudy in Cincinnati. For a world perspective on what's happening in Israel, WVHU brings you the BBC World News overnights and the BBC News Hour weekdays at 9 a.m. Keeping you informed and engaged every day. 91.7 WVHU and 88.5 WMUB. I'm Tony Rose. Thanks for listening.
This is the New Yorker Radio Hour, a co-production of WNYC Studios and The New Yorker.
Welcome to the New Yorker Radio Hour. I'm David Remnick. When the film director Werner Herzog was just 11 years old, this was in the mid-50s, a man with a mobile movie projector came to his one-room school in Bavaria and showed a film, the first film that young Werner had ever seen. He was not terribly impressed. But film became his calling, and now at 81, he's made more than 70 features and documentaries, including early epics like Fitzcarraldo, and documentaries like Cave of Forgotten Dreams and Grizzly Man, which never quite leaves my mind.
Perfection belonged to the bears, but once in a while Treadwell came face to face with the harsh reality of wild nature. This did not fit into his sentimentalized view that everything out there was good and the universe in balance and in harmony.
And although acting was never his focus, Werner Herzog has become an in-demand character actor in Hollywood. largely because of that unmistakable and menacing voice. He's popped up as a villain in blockbusters like Jack Reacher and the Star Wars TV series The Mandalorian. A few weeks ago in The New Yorker, we published an excerpt from Werner Herzog's new memoir, which is called, and it's a great title, Every Man for Himself and God Against All. It's a title from one of...
Los Angeles. That first restaurant that I mentioned was near Olvera Street, which is on the edge, the northern edge of downtown Los Angeles. And when that lease was up, you know, she was right off of Sunset Boulevard. She could have gone 2 miles east into East Los Angeles to open her second restaurant and been surrounded by people who spoke Spanish like her, most of whom would have been Mexican. But instead, she chose to go 2 miles west into Echo Park. And Echo Park, even then, was a multicultural, multiracial, geographic crossroads. So she already knew she was going to be somewhere that would attract a wider clientele. And she was fine with, you know, also serving dishes that would appeal to this clientele. But she then also, she had signs in English that also said authentic Mexican food, right? So she kind of wanted both. On top of that, during this time period, the 1950s and 60s, you have the growth of the Mexican population in Los Angeles and the greater American West. And that's because, again, you need laborers. It's post-World War II. She opens her restaurant, again, on the heels of another war, the World War II, and she wants to ride that World War II prosperity. And it's also a time that we've imported Mexican workers through the Bracero program, the guest worker program between the U.S. and Mexico, which lasts until 1964, even though it's initiated because of World War II. So you have Mexicans coming from throughout the central plateau of Mexico. And so people aren't from Nayarit necessarily, but they recognize the sign, right? She doesn't name the restaurant El Zarape or, you know, El Sombrero or something, some kind of Mexican icon. She wants you to know this is a place-based Mexican identity. And because people in Mexico at this point, you know, really have a regional identity, a state-based identity, not necessarily a Mexican identity. And so somebody can say, I'm not from Nayarit, but I'm from Jalisco. I'm going to find something close enough to me there. And many people I interviewed, including people that worked there, said, I heard of the Nayarit, and I went there to see what it was about, because just the name made it stand out.
Interesting. So obviously you were the granddaughter of this incredible restaurateur, and you know, you carry her legacy in that way. But what made you want to write this book?
I think going back to what you said earlier about how restaurants can be a place where you can be your full self, claim space, and belong. Because I got to experience the restaurant in the tail end of it, I always had that sense that it was special. And even beyond that, when I look at who comprises my family, it took me years to realize they're not my blood kin, they're my fictive kin. And by fictive kin, I mean the way that the anthropologists talk about, you know, people that you call aunts and uncles, sometimes through ceremonies such as a godparent. But for me, my kin is a place-based kin. One, that they're Mexican and that most of us are from the state of Nayarit, but two, that they settled in Echo Park
they settled in Los Angeles and they chose each other as family. We kind of use that phrase now as chosen family, and we think of it as a more modern concept, a more contemporary concept. But I see that with the workers from the Nayarit. They're still friends. We just went on Sunday to the party of Ramon Barragan, who is one of the workers from the Nayarit. He started as a dishwasher when he was 17 years old. My grandmother trained him to be a cook, because that was the other thing she did. She gave the workers upward mobility. And when he was ready to start his own restaurant, she gave him the seed money. And he opened a restaurant a few blocks east of her, also on Sunset Boulevard, called Barragan's. And he went on to open 2 more restaurants, and so we're celebrating his 92nd birthday. And I call him Theo. Again, it took me years to find out he wasn't my uncle. His daughters and I, two of us even look alike, so everybody likes to joke around like, wait a minute, are we really not related? But it is that way that you become family. So many people at these kind of mom and pop.
The Strums.
Workers, that they would go out together.
Gang Amadeus Mozart. Charles McCarris conducting the Scottish Chamber Orchestra with Eric Rusk, featured on the horn solo. Classical 90.9 WGUC. Just before 3 o'clock, I'm Michael Grayson. Thank you for listening. Tune in tonight at 8 o'clock for our broadcast of the Cincinnati's May Festival. Features acclaimed conductor Marin Alsop on the stand, leading performances of works by Barber, Copeland, and others. That's beginning at 8 o'clock tonight on 90.9 WGUC.
It's working, but time for something new. Or it's not working, and you need to get it out of the garage. Donating your car to WGUC is a great way to support your favorite public radio station and make room for your new ride at the same time. Donating your car is easy, and it's a great way to give to WGUC. More at WGUC.org under support, or by calling 855-277-2346.
Classical 90.9 WGUC Cincinnati. Music for your heart, mind, and spirit.
Music next from 3-time Grammy winner violinist Hilary Hahn. Here she is with the Frankfurt Radio Symphony, conducted by Andres Orozco Estrada, with Antonin Dvorak's Violin Concerto in A minor.
guy must be oblivious. Completely clueless.
Law firms, right? Same day, all one day. I do everything quickly. By the end of the day, I had 3 offers. And at the time, my wife's parents lived next door at a lake house with, at that time, he was a sitting federal judge. And he said, what did you interview? And I said, A, B, and C. And so he said, well, what you going to go with? And I said, C. Well, C was Mayor Brown. And at the time, they had just been through Penn Square. And their client was Continental Bank.
Penn Square was a small Oklahoma bank that collapsed in 1982. Continental Illinois was a bigger bank that had taken on a lot of bad loans from Penn Square. In order to prevent a catastrophic bank failure, the federal government took over Continental. The law firm that Ray wanted to work for, Mayor Brown, had a long-standing relationship with Continental.
And there was lots of tabloids about, you know, how does this affect the firm and its future and its partners and all this other stuff. And I had 2 other law firms that were very, very good law firms. And so the federal judge looked at me and he goes, oh my God, why would you do that? Like, didn't you read the paper? Don't you understand all the problems they're going through? And I said, that's what I kind of like about them. I said, they're kind of the underdog. They're going to work harder. They're going to have to change things. They're going to do things differently. The other firms, they're comfortable where they are. I want to go with the firm that's kind of down a little bit. Because where there's failure, there's opportunity for the right person.
That may have been the first time John Ray understood that failure breeds opportunity, but it was far from the last. His next job was at Waste Management, the trash company.
The year I got there, I think we did 300 small acquisitions. And the saying within the law firm, which was so true, is that if you worked at Waste Management in the law department, you did everything from A to Z, adultery to zoning.
Wait, what's the adultery?
You know, there'd be an affair, the sales guy with somebody else in the office, and there would be some discrimination claim that would get filed out of it. It covered the waterfront of every legal issue, so it was such broad experience.
In 1998, Ray became general counsel at the clothing manufacturer Fruit of the Loom, best known for its underwear. A year later, the company filed for bankruptcy, and Ray was chosen to oversee that process. A few years after that, he got the Enron job. Ever since, he's been jumping from one disaster to the next. So, what's his plan for FTX? It's coming up. I'm Stephen Dubner, and you are listening to Freakonomics Radio.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's currently 4:20, and it is 55 degrees and still cloudy in Cincinnati. WPHU is with you everywhere. The WPHU mobile app is available for Androids and iPhones at your app store. You can hear the news on WPHU, the NPR network, and the BBC, plus all your favorite weekly shows at the touch of a button. I'm Tony Ray. Thanks for listening.
Support comes from Central Bank. Since 1946, Central Bank remains a community bank dedicated to serving consumers and businesses through 24-hour online, mobile, and phone banking services and 4 locations in Crestview Hills, Florence, Fort Mitchell, and Union. Learn more at centralbank.com. Central Bank, we start with you. Member FDIC.
Public radio isn't something you think about all the time, but the stories you hear do stick with you. And the Public Radio podcast are some of your favorites, and you do listen every day. WVXU is your station. Listeners like you keep it going strong. Please donate at WVXU.org. Thank you.
Hi, it's Steve Inskeep. At Morning Edition, we're honored that people from around the world trust us with their stories.
We are a family that was broken up by migration when my father left.
We need our elders. There are language holders. There are culture sharers.
We need some changes. Things must change.
Join us for Morning Edition from NPR News for stories that bring the news to life.
With host Marianne Zaleski on 91.7 WVXU.
This is Freakonomics Radio with your host, Stephen Dubner.
In case you don't know any more about cryptocurrency than John Ray did when he was brought in to run FTX, we can help you with that. Last summer, we put out a 3-part series called What Can Blockchain Do For You? You might want to start with episode number 508. It was called Does the Crypto Crash Mean the Blockchain is Over? It's optional, but perhaps useful. You can find those episodes on any podcast app or on our website, Freakonomics.com. Anyway, just a few months after we put out that series, in early November of 2022, word started to get out that the cryptocurrency trading exchange FTX was insolvent. Co-founder and CEO Sam Bankman-Fried scrambled to raise money to save the firm, but he couldn't stop FTX customers from selling their crypto and cashing out. It was basically a bank run. Other top FTX executives immediately quit. The firm's lawyers were telling Bankman-Fried he should declare bankruptcy and turn the company over to John Ray. At 8 p.m. on November 10th, one of the lawyers sent Bankman-Fried the paperwork that would give full control of the company to John Ray. With increasing urgency, they pushed him to sign it. At 4 in the morning on Friday, November 11th, Bankman-Fried signed. John Ray's first move as emergency CEO was to file for bankruptcy in Delaware.
There's other cases I've been involved in where there's weeks ahead of time where you're brought in, but it's a rare case where you're literally brought in within the 24 hours.
A few days later, Ray submitted his first written statement to the Delaware Bankruptcy Court. I have over 40 years of legal and restructuring experience, he wrote. I have been the chief restructuring officer or chief executive officer in several of the largest corporate failures in history. Never in my career have I seen such a complete failure of corporate controls and such a complete absence of trustworthy financial information as occurred here. This situation is unprecedented. Shortly after that, Ray testified in front of Congress.
The FTX group's collapse appears to stem from absolute concentration of control in the hands of a small group of grossly inexperienced and unsophisticated individuals who failed to implement virtually any of the systems or controls that are necessary for a company entrusted with other people's money or assets.
When you come into these bankruptcies the way I do, there's such a freedom, right? Because you weren't involved. You didn't do anything wrong. So you can come in there with a clean heart and an open mind, and you can say what you know.
Here's one thing he said to Congress. He said, this is just old-fashioned embezzlement, taking money from others and using it for your own purposes. This is not sophisticated at all. I think most people who knew anything about FTX were probably surprised by that thing. Oh my gosh, I thought it was extremely sophisticated. So what was your purpose in being that black and white, really, in your description?
Well, because I think people were sort of looking at this as a condemnation of crypto. Like, all crypto is bad. One congressman tried to get me to call it creepy dough. And I'm sorry, I'm not a crypto expert, I'm certainly not a regulator, but I looked at this and said, I don't think that's the issue. I think this is just someone stealing money, and not really in a sophisticated way. I mean, Enron was very sophisticated. They would set up separate special purpose vehicles and do off-balance sheet transactions and so on and so forth.
Meaning when they lost, they would separate and get it off the main books so that the company still looked good. You're saying that was a sophisticated accounting fraud, at least. In this case, what were the types of sins or crimes, and how unsophisticated were they?
People compare this to Enron, they compare this to Bernie Madoff. Both those companies, they didn't just have one set of books, they had two sets of books. We don't have a set of books. We don't even have one. All right? That's the big difference. Because if you took those two books and you put them together, you've got the true picture of what happened. Very accurately recorded, mind you. But here, I mean, we don't have, income statements and balance sheets. They don't have records of loans they made. All kinds of transactions are not documented. This is like shattering glass, looking all over the floor trying to pick up the pieces.
So how do you do that? It seems like it's kind of a forensic act as much as anything. But if there are no records, if there were just tens, hundreds of millions of dollars flowing in and out of the main firm to associate firms to outside firms to partners, but then also these donations to political candidates, donations to the effective altruism movement, millions and millions and millions of dollars without record keeping. Are there enough clues and trails to all of that money to essentially recreate where the money went, or are there some things that will be forever lost?
It's an exercise. It's a daunting exercise. Essentially, what we have to do is create or recreate those books as we go at a very primary level. And you start with, asset movements in and out of bank accounts, and you trace the money that came in, the money that went from one entity to another, where it ultimately ended up. If it's on an outside source and you have a right to get it, you go get it, you go get it. You sort of put Humpty Dumpty back together again.
So as far as I can tell, John, you generally don't spend a lot of time trashing the previous management when you take over a failed firm. But that's not the case with FTX and Sam Bankman-Fried. You've described him at length as, out of control, childish, not transparent. Why is this case different?
People have to have an understanding of what happened, right? Unlike some bankruptcies, a lot of bankruptcies are where there's commercial parties affected, right? For example, if Kmart, if you will, has a trade payable that's not paid, they're a commercial party, they negotiated a contract, they understand the industry, they knew the risks, et cetera, et cetera. Customers are a bit different. They don't understand what happened. We have creditors all around the world in multiple languages. They're owed an explanation of what happened. So we've tried to take extra steps to tell them what happened, because really it's a shock and it's unexplainable to them, and you've got to give them the backstory. But the one thing that I'm responsible for is just increase value, so that ultimately there's less to fight about. I just figure if I bring in an increased value, all the problems will naturally either be made lesser or solve themselves.
But is the ultimate allocation in the hands of a judge in Delaware? Is that the way it works?
At the end of the day, we put forward a plan. We try to get as many people agreeing with it. In every case I've been involved in, we've had a consensual plan. Sometimes it takes a lot of negotiations, some mediations to get there. There's compromises that are made, but ultimately you try to get a compromise that everybody can agree with. Not everybody's always 100% happy, but people get on board for things, and then we put that forward, and ultimately the judge, there's some standards and some statutory tests about fairness and equity that the judge has to opine on, and that's the process.
So, John, if you had to predict now, what share of all dollars would you say will be recovered?
Oh, I am not going to venture. I don't want to underestimate our ability there.
What is FTX a year or two from now? Does it exist, or is it wiped off the face of the earth?
It's hard to say. We're looking very strongly at restarting the exchange. There was some capabilities to the exchange that people liked. There was certainly a need for competition within the sector. But look, if there's a life for it, the market will determine that, frankly. It will do what makes sense to maximize value for creditors. And at the end of the day, I don't have a predetermined plan. I mean, people always ask me, what's your plan? And I always say, my plan is to maximize value for the creditors. However plan that takes, that's what we do.
John, not long after this happened, I flew into Atlanta and I summoned an Uber, and the guy came with the nicest car I'd ever been in, period. Forget about an Uber. It must be a $150,000 car. And I said, what's up? What are you doing with this car driving an Uber? And he said, well, I've got some FTX problems right now.
I mean, there's people, they've got children, they've got to put them through school, they've got a house, they may have a mortgage. If you were a customer and you have money hung up, you want to get it back as quickly as possible. But I have occasion to actually talk one-on-one to creditors and hear their personal stories. You need to be able to do that. If you don't step in those shoes and see it from that angle, you're really depriving yourself of the ability to fully understand the problem. And if you don't fully understand it, you can't solve it. I grew up in a very sort of rough and tumble background, but the other side is there's a guy that grew up in a town like that, a blue-collar town where people didn't necessarily get what they deserve. And so always in the back is I'm fighting for that underdog. And the process, obviously, because there's so many creditors affected and such a large process of investigating and collecting and sorting through the liabilities and developing a plan, There's a natural slowness to that process, the bureaucracy of that process, and it's hard to convince people that people in my job care about that, because we're all viewed as making lots of money and so on and so forth.
John Ray doesn't come cheap. He bills at $1,300 an hour, and on a job like this, he brings with him a large team of lawyers and consultants. As of this recording, the total bill since FTX declared bankruptcy is well over $300 million. Those fees come out of the pool that will be used to pay back creditors.
Crime is very expensive. You know, a lot of people get hurt, and it's very expensive to fix it, right? But on the other hand, we're sort of investing in a recovery if you look at it from that perspective.
Do you ever work on more than one bankruptcy at a time?
I only do one at a time, active. There's another sort of tranche of these guys called independent directors, and they get called in by the law firms, and they drop them into companies that are about to go into bankruptcy, and they form a special committee of these independents. And some of these guys have like 10 cases going at a time. And I just know what it's like to be involved heavily in one case. I mean, if you do it right, it sort of rips your life apart. Doing 10 of them would be absurd.
So it sounds like there should be a bigger market for people like you. Why isn't there?
There is a very big market for it, but I think it's channeled through these big firms.
These big firms are consultants known for managing bankruptcies and bringing in chief restructuring officers. Some of the biggest are FTI Consulting, Alex Partners, and Alvarez & Marsal.
If you go to the bigger firms, they've got a pyramid model, right? Which means there's 10 people at the bottom, and above them are 5 people, and above them are 3 people, and then there's one guy above them. It's leverage, so you're billing somebody out at, $1,000 an hour, but you're only paying them $300. That's the leverage model, and so everybody kind of gravitates to that model. I don't have any leverage. Whatever I bill, net of my costs, that's what I make. And a lot of people come to me and say, like, are you dumb? Why don't you just add 10 people? And I've never wanted to do that. If I get into an industry, whether it's crypto, whether it's energy or retail, I can hire best-in-class advisors, best-in-class consultants to be my employees on any given case. The best people in the world, the best judgment, the highest output people. I don't have to rely on the B's and C's. I got all A's.
Shortly after John Ray took his current job, the Wall Street Journal published an article headlined, "Does FTX's new CEO have the worst job in corporate America?" Ray thinks the Journal has it backwards. He says that being an emergency CEO for whatever company is better than being a regular CEO.
Every CEO in America is jealous of this job. They absolutely detest the fact that they can't do what I do. So I come in, there's an office I don't like. We're not using. I reject it out of bankruptcy. There's a contract that's not very favorable. I get rid of it. I look at all my employees and I say, God, we've got 100 too many. I get rid of them that day. There's a business that's not making money. I go in and I just shoot it. Boom, gone, done. Numbers don't make sense. There's no probability of success. I shoot it. CEOs can't do that, right? They just can't do that. They don't have the flexibility. They don't have the processes. And everything happens so quickly. So you're taking like 10 years of a life of a company and what optimally would be everything that you would want to accomplish, and you shrink wrap this thing down to 12, 18 months, and you sort of like turbocharge everything. It's dynamic, it's exciting. I don't know if you've ever been on a condo board, right? It's really what I call a lowest common denominator business. The least objectionable idea gets done. Everything that's a problem I want to fix like tomorrow, because that's the cadence that I'm used to. And most CEOs, they'd have to have 30 separate meetings with each of the independent directors, maybe at the Harvard Club or something, and they have to socialize the idea. Forget that.
So John, it turned out that the writer Michael Lewis had been hanging around with Sam Bankman-Fried when FTX went under, and he was writing a book about him. I'm curious whether Michael's information was helpful to you in any way?
No, I'm way too busy to help Michael on his book.
No, I'm asking if there was anything in his reporting that was helpful to you, because, you walked into this total chaos where there was no chronicling of anything, and I figured he has at least been chronicling.
He probably had eyewitness to a lot of the bills being generated from the local restaurants, but obviously our focus is really on collecting and marshaling assets and preventing further liability. So he's got an angle. I don't know what it is. I wish him well on that.
That Michael Lewis book on Sam Bankman-Fried has just been published. It's called Going Infinite, The Rise and Fall of a New Tycoon. We are actually planning to interview Lewis about that book sometime soon. If you have questions you would like us to ask him, send us an email to radio@freakonomics.com. After the break, more with FTX's emergency CEO, John Ray, and we ask, would you want to hire Ray if you were a city that was going bankrupt? I'm Stephen Dubner. This is Freakonomics Radio. We'll be right back.
Monday's Cincinnati edition is dedicated to explaining and answering your questions about Cincinnati's proposed sale of the Southern Railway. You'll hear from both sides of the issue at noon and 8 o'clock Monday on 91.7 WVHU, WVHU.org.
Support comes from Photo Focus. You can join them and Creative Time on October 20th and 21st for The Convening, 2 days of art performance and discussion about land use, borders, and exchange at multiple venues.